Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our third day of the conference of the third Vienna Strategy Conference. We're going to continue today with the panel Strategy and Religion, Values and Intercultural Affairs. Good morning to everybody who have made it here so early in order to join us for this panel on religion and values. We have altogether 5 speakers for this panel. I'm Brigadier Dr. Roman Schuh. I'm going to be the moderator. In my usual functions, I work with the Federal Ministry of Defense. I'm in charge of human-oriented leadership and defense policy. We have 4 speakers that I will introduce before each of the panelists is going to talk. I'd like to welcome Military Superintendent Dr. Karl Reinhard Trauner on the left. Then a hearty welcome to Professor Diplom Engineer Architect from ETH Zurich, Dr. Christian Hanos, and then on the other side, from your side on the right, it's Magister Stefan Gugurel, and last but not least, to my left, Colonel Dr. Georg Ebner. A warm welcome to all the panelists. So what is the aim of our panel? What we want to do today is, according to the ideas we've had from Brigadier Paeschel, it is our objective for the aim in view of the development of a strategy theory to look at terms narrative, cyber hybridity, and resilience in a critical manner from the overall strategic view. For us, the religious, cultural, and intercultural aspects as well as values are in the foreground. And this is, of course, something that the 4 panelists will each dwell on in their respective talks. We have representatives from religion, intercultural sphere, and also from the value-oriented view within the Austrian Federal Army. I'm also going to make a contribution, and I would like to kick off with my presentation. For each presentation, we will have about 10 minutes, as it is planned for this conference. We will introduce our respective topics, and then we will have time for discussion and for your questions. About an hour and a half is what's scheduled. I would like to point out there is a panel on culture and strategy taking place at the same time, and afterwards we're going to do summaries here in the plenary session of both panels. I'd like to get started. I'm going to show you, I have a presentation. Here it is. My topic, resilience. I'm focusing on the term resilience, and I would like to look at resilience as a part of the value chain in military culture, and I'm referring to the Austrian Federal Army here. Resilience. We have heard quite a few things about resilience. I've heard that resilience actually does not have so much relevance anymore. And for the Federal Army, it is relevant. We define it as the ability of a system that is exposed to risks and dangers to cope with the consequences of this, to adapt and to recover from them while keeping its basic structures. This is in the military strategic concept of the Ministry of Defense. So, how do I get to military culture? Military culture is a topic that we deal with again and again. And I have put a word cloud together. What does it all involve? I don't want to give you a straightforward definition here, but I'd rather give you some terms just to show you how wide this term is. And we're going to touch on various aspects: sociology, music, tradition, values. They all make part of it. Religion, the flag, all kinds. There are many more aspects. So what makes a culture? What makes a system and its culture? These are the questions we're dealing with here. Resilience, I would like to divide it into two categories. That is organizational resilience on the one hand, that is defined as follows today: the ability to actually cope with external disturbances without any change to the system functions. And resilient organizations can keep up their functionality with view to certain events. And on the other hand, after the interference, they can restore it. So this is the basic thought here on the organizational resilience side. What you see here, the Roman legions, I think this shows it very well. How do we see this in the Austrian Federal Army? Organizational resilience in the army can be seen as guaranteeing the material and personnel readiness of the military. We have human resources that are fairly large compared to other armies in Europe, including militia and the reserves, and we have self-sufficient structures, especially in logistics, when it comes to supplies, logistics, and organizational matters. Of course, we might want to talk about is what is really still done by ourselves and what is being outsourced, and where do we draw the line. Okay, but this is not really our topic here today. In places like Iraq, where we are deployed, there is a lot of civilian equipment that's being used, civilian logistics that's being used to support the military. Provisioning is one of the integral aspects here. And we have heard this today. We heard it yesterday in a lecture that the example of the gas cooker, the camping cooker, who said, well, it's ideal if we all have it in our basement, because if we really need it, we couldn't buy it because it would be sold out within hours. So guaranteeing resources also on the personal level. And the redundant leadership organization, this is also the case in the military. So this is organization. Now let's take a look at the HR side, the personal resilience side. Also, I'd like to talk about my work and my experience in my department. This is the ability to be resilient, to be able to cope with external pressures, and in order to recover after a stress period, and also to grow as a person, as a personality. Here, a beautiful example. If you know the nutcracker, it actually collapses when you press it. When you release it, it straightens up again. So this is certainly a good image for resilience, also from the psychological side. And this, of course, means that if you want to keep personal resilience, you have to be able to bear stress and strain. This is something that we train in the military. It's one of the training tasks of the military. Automation drills, camaraderie, well, I guess not automation, but training, camaraderie, appreciation are very important factors. And there are many other points that I will come back to, also knowing that about your profession, what are the ethical values that are behind my work. And here I think the military plays a significant role when it comes to professional ethical education. It makes it a very special profession. And all this, of course, leads to a situation where certain self-management is required for a leadership structure. There are interrelationships between personal resilience and organizational resilience. They are correlated and feed into each other. To maintain resilience, what do we do? What is necessary? We need to support the leadership, the top leaders. We need to have the adequate resources. This is always a topic, not only in the Austrian Federal Army. Flexibility of action, transparency, and last but not least, continued improvement processes. In the Federal Army, we actually have within personal resilience and introduced a new level. We're doing a study to analyze the status quo in the Austrian Federal Army, and we're looking at various areas and aspects of this. On the right, you can see leadership of staff members, image, training, education, inner order, and instructions. So what is most effective is working on the personal side, but also at the organizational side at the same time. This is lived military culture. And concluding, I would like to address the question that is the conference theme. Is resilience, is the term old wine in new skins, or is it new wine in old skins, as was already mentioned by some speakers? Well, the term resilience is actually new term, but it's been lived in the military for many, many years. It's all about resilience. And this brings me to the end, and I would like to hand over to the next speaker, and that is, well, I have to check. I'm very happy to welcome as the next speaker So, I'm very happy to introduce as the next speaker, Military Superintendent Dr. Karl Reinhard Trauner. Dr. Trauner is a military priest. He studied theology. He is of the Protestant faith. He studied in Vienna and Erlangen since '95. His main job is to be the military priest and head of the Institute of Military Ethical Studies. And since 2013, he's military superintendent. This means the highest ranking representative of the Protestant priests pastors in the military. He teaches at the University of Vienna and at Lavag, and he is and I know him personally. He really knows the military extremely well and always manages in his talks to make excellent points, to give us great insights. And we're looking forward to your talk. I hope I haven't said too much at this point. I'm looking forward, as I said, to your presentation, Reinhard.
Mit dem kommen wir weiter, oder mit? Passt gut, passt. Danke sehr. Ich bedanke mich sehr herzlich für das.
Thank you very much for the kind words of introduction. Whether actually will be able to deliver, I don't know, because it's really very, very early. Now, let me try to use a systematic approach, a deep dive, so to speak. As a theologian, of course, I got stuck with this image of wine and the wineskins, and with the help of this narrative, because actually it is a narrative as well, and not exactly new, it already occurred in the Bible, of course, so with the help of this traditional narrative, I would like to approach the subject. So, this image itself is a narrative, with a long-standing tradition. In my deliberations, I will refer to religion, which is, of course, my background. But I think I can raise a claim that there is a general validity to my deliberations. So I will just try to address some things on the surface, and I hope that we'll be able to go deeper in the following. So I'll talk about old, young, wine and wineskins. So actually, it all results from wine and skins and old and young. This results in a certain structure. So you can have old wine in old skins, young wine in new skins, young wine in old or in new skins. So these are the 4 different options that we have resulting from this image. Now let me start with old wine in old skins. So basically, when you think about what is old, you will soon find that everything that is related to the nature of man. So these things have always been that way, and in light of today's weather, there's no bad weather, there's just bad equipment. So that's a traditional military wisdom. So what you're seeing here is Ötzi. Well, many thousand years ago, he froze to death on this glacier. And, well, you may wonder whether we'd have frozen to death if he had been properly clothed. The plastic lying next to him, it doesn't, of course, date back to his day and age. So the question about a certain uniform and basic provisions, eating, drinking, whatever, I don't know whether there's any sources about this. I guess not, but I guess that it's always been like that in the military. That's related to the model of Arnold Gellen, deficits in man. Of course, this is anthropological by nature. You can continue this at a theological way. Wolfgang Bannenberg in Munich then raised this to the theological level. This is something very ancient. If you think about Abel and Cain, so the first thing that happens after, well, people have to leave paradise, the original sin, is that one kills the other. So I don't know whether this is historical, but it is quite, well, remarkable. So basically, diversity management, it's also something that I'm always involved in. I guess that the lieutenant in the early days, well, maybe didn't choose the fat guy for his companion, but the wiry one. So I guess these processes have always happened in the armed forces. So basically it's not anything new. Now let's move on to new wine in new skins. I said that there are basic underlying anthropological fixtures, and where we want to think about these, there is a development. Interestingly, it's a development that sometimes we're not even noticing or perceiving. I don't know whether you've ever thought about how our, well, self-confidence developed. So our reflected self-image, that hasn't always been there. So the first self-portrait of a man is in Vienna. It's from Rudolf the Stifter in the middle of the 14th century, Rudolf the founder. And this is the more recent European history where they didn't try to show a ruler or the office, but the person. So it is actually about well, gaining insight about the person. And this is continued if you read the autobiography of Götz von Berlichingen, and I'm sure that you know him in various contexts and statements that he made. But anyway, if you were to read the autobiography of Götz von Berlichingen in the second half of the 16th century, you will be astonished how he deals with the physical, the body dimension. Apparently he lost his hand in combat, and, well, he describes his pain, and the first thing that he focuses on is how to best fight with just one hand. So as soon as he's somewhat recovered, he, well, just had to learn to guide the sword with the other hand so that he can go back into war. So this is an approach that is quite alien to us and foreign to us, and that isn't actually practiced like that in Europe. But this just goes to show how the self-image changes. Now let us leap forward to the 19th century. The way this is continued is, the logistic of dental care in the Battle of Solferino. I think you're familiar with these stories. Well, to go into battle without a dentist would be unthinkable. So the image of man is subject to change. And even today we have a military psychologist, of course, in an army. Otherwise it would be inconceivable. And without a military pastor or a priest. So the oldest documentation of a military chaplain is in Vienna. So in the National Library we also have a Christian chaplain. Well, actually he's on the wage list, on the payroll. So he was recognized. Resilience is also a very ancient subject of religion. So basically it is the topic of religion, not in a static sense, as Brigadier Peichel said yesterday, but in a dynamic sense. So how do you deal with challenges in order to use this terrible word? Now, there's also something new, and I won't talk about this because it's been referred to at length, is where technical developments happen. There are technical quantum leaps that occur, and this in turn has an impact on, if you will, the ethical or religious domain. So the bellum justum teaching has to be questioned, of course, and this is a result. So this is not really anything really exciting, what I told you about, but now things are getting complicated, because when you talk about the image of the wineskin in antiquity, so it was made of leather, and the crux of the matter of the wine and the skins is if you use young wine that is still fermenting, and if you pour this into an old brittle skin, it may break, tear, and the skin as well as the wine are ruined as a consequence. So if you have old wine and new skins, that's okay. Young wine and new skins is also okay, but young wine and an old wineskin, that's very dangerous. And I think that this is the very image that points to that, and that's the moral of the story. So you have to be really careful to make sure that we don't have new developments and we turn a blind eye to them, act as if they didn't exist. Let me give you a couple of examples. I think that you're all familiar with this World Ethos project of Hans Küng, where Hans Küng worked out that religions all have a common foundation, a consensus. I'm not talking against this World Ethos project, but I think that religion has lost its explosiveness because everything is wonderful and fine and dandy, and we all love each other and we're friendly to each other. But if you use this basic fixture of old wine in new skins, so old wine is in new skin, so it has lost its explosive nature, then the problem of this explosive power of religion is just misjudged. And if you consider why there are narratives and why we are talking about narratives here, because narrative is a very recent concept. I think it's been in use for about 20 years now. So why did this concept develop? Well, obviously because the old myths have crumbled and fallen apart and no longer understood and are no longer convincing. And this is why we develop new concepts such as the narrative. But actually the concept of narrative isn't convincing anymore either. Otherwise we wouldn't be meeting here and we wouldn't be talking about this concept of narrative. political correctness can also be understood as an attempt to hold on to these narratives that are crumbling and falling apart more and more. So there's a breach of taboo that's modern today. And what's also modern and in and hip is to be not politically correct in one style of argument. So I think what we can derive from this is that we are in the midst of an identity crisis because we're talking about narratives. So the crisis of narratives is also a crisis of postmodernity. And if we act as if this crisis didn't exist, if we act as if everything were fine and dandy, and if we, well, just leave this new wine in old skins, I think that's, well, the pitfall and the risk that can be derived from this image. And I'll come to my conclusion, and that's also my summary. And that's, of course, well, a bit superficial if I say that if it won't help us, it won't hurt us. But there are, of course, ancient phenomena, there's no doubt. And I think Brigadier Peichler and you, Roman, you also referred to the fact that we are talking about these old terms and concepts that are just, well, given new names. Especially acronyms are often hard to understand or completely incomprehensible. Well, hashtag, for example, how would that have been understood in the 60s? Hashtag. A bit differently, I guess, yeah. So, of course, new concepts point to, well, failures and omissions, but I think they also force us to rethink, to update our knowledge, and to maybe, well, remember more important things. And I do have the hope, to stay with the image of wine, if we fill old wine into new skins, maybe this can also increase the quality of the wine, like the barrique wine, for example. I'm a wine drinker, as you may have guessed. So that is the case for the barrique wine. It gets better if you fill it into new skins. So I think when these things designate old phenomena, I think it is better to fill old wine into new skins rather than fill young wine into old skins, because the skins will break and maybe we will break too, if we are extremely unlucky. Okay, thank you very much. The next speaker is Colonel Dr. Georg Ebner.
Colonel Ebner was officer and researcher at the Institute of Human and Social Sciences of the Defense Academy of Lavak. He is also a clinical psychologist and has actually worked as such also abroad in various deployments, Kosovo, for example, and also in Pakistan. And since 2015, he is research and officer at LAVAC here and at the Center for Human-Centered Military Leadership. And since 2016, he is in charge of the desk for coaching, mediation, and team development. And I'd like to add, Georg Ebner is a recognized expert in the field of intercultural competences, and this is what he will talk about today. Georg, floor is yours. Brigadier, thank you for the kind introduction. I hope I'll meet all your expectations here. I'm very happy to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, as I said, it's great to return to the strategy conference. I was here last year as well, and this year I have been asked to present a topic that shows us some aspects that are related to this year's theme. I'm grateful to Brigadier Peischel that he's working with these terms, that he's trying to shed light on them. When I was preparing for this conference and looking at the title, I realized that actually I have something to contribute here, hybridity and diversity. You may have realized that maybe there are different views that people may have on when it comes to hybridity. Diversity and hybridity, these are two terms I would like to talk about, and I would like to talk about various qualities of these systems, how they actually, to be understood in the military context, what challenges result, what are the necessities in a system that actually are important, and how can we benefit from focusing on this. I would like to make some statements on culture and mission, a mixture of culture. Let's call it cultural confetti. Heimat, the German word, homeland, is very hard to actually fathom. People want to be at home. They look for it on the outside, on the inside. And it is always great to actually see what other cultures have to offer. People find it interesting. Connected with this tradition is, of course, good food, music, and many other things. For me, the mixture of cultures is an enrichment. From a culinary point of view, Döner is something we don't want to do without. Identity is something that I connect with myself. Who am I and what am I? For me, it's decisive. What is decisive is my job, my family. They make my identity. It becomes very clear that a mixture of various approaches, views, and attitudes is something we actually live with and cannot really imagine to be living without, and they lead to new qualities. What is hybridity now? Hybridity is a mixture of two previously separate systems. The term comes from agriculture originally, as we have already heard, and biology. In biology, it's a mixture of a botanical crossing. Later on, it was then used in various academic disciplines especially in social linguistics. It became a technical term. And this is why we're talking about it today. The term was established in cultural sciences, especially in the context of interculturality, and where it is a mixture of recombination of various elements. Mixtures and new combinations enrich and supplement existing systems. This is very important. They are enriching it. They are not mutually exclusive. They make new structures possible, as we have just seen in the presentation before. New combinations, new structures become possible. Societies benefit from these new combinations and thus expand their horizon. New views and make it possible, make it easier to look beyond, extend the horizon, so to say, and to think beyond it. And this is why we are here, and this is why we have this conference here and these lectures. I would like to show a brief video to illustrate these thoughts. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't get the sound of the film, so I can't translate.
Als Hybride bezeichnet, die aus einer Kreuzung zwei verschiedener Arten oder Rassen hervorgegangen sind. Kreuzen sich zum Beispiel zufällig Schaf und Ziege, ist das Ergebnis eine Schiege. Der Hybridbegriff wird aber auch in anderen Bereichen verwendet, in der Technik, der Wirtschaft oder auch für den Menschen.
So this is about the term hybridity as it's used in biology and other fields.
Zeit wurde die Hybridität von ihrem rassistischen Kontext losgelöst und als Metapher für kulturelle Vermischung auf die Bereiche Kultur und Identität übertragen. Hybride kulturelle Identitäten bilden sich vorwiegend aufgrund von Migration und in Gebieten, in denen konfessionelle oder nationale Minderheiten leben. Denn Hybridität entsteht, wenn es zu kulturellen Überschneidungen kommt. Gegensätzliche Denkweisen und Elemente aus den verschiedenen kulturellen, sozialen oder religiösen Lebenswelten werden dann vom Individuum neu zusammengesetzt. Das Ergebnis ist eine hybride kulturelle Identität.
Ja, Hybridität ist
Hybridity is one of the key terms in the discussion on migration and globalization. And its current use is actually pretty dominant. Homike Baba refers to processes of cultural contexts that are not on the same level in the colonial context. He is the founding father of the use of this term in this meaning. Colonized consciously and unconsciously take on symptoms of the signs of the colonizers and integrate it into their system. By doing so, a hybrid third results, a hybrid space as it's called, that does not really completely correspond to either the culture of the colonizer or of the colonized. And this means that this concept of hybridity actually meets the ideas of questions the idea of a concept. So what we have here is something that is a heterogeneous mixture, and the hybrid character of traditional European cultures that are based on all kinds of principles is less obvious than the hybridity as observed in colonial culture. To deny this hybridization is, in my opinion, something that cannot be done. Hybridization is one of the core theses of it says that the relationships between different cultures and also within one culture are considered ambivalent hybridization processes and can be described as such as the contact between language, worldview of people of different origins by having had intensive contacts with each other. Hybridization not only refers to the mixture, but also the confrontation of different heterogeneous cultural elements. And therefore, this name also stands for transcultural transmission, so-called cultural crossing, where it is no longer understood as the biological crossing, but as the intercrossing. It is transcultural traveling, where habits, customs, convictions, and ways of thinking are actually mixing as a result of migration movements. Hybridization and migration is a topic that leads to various phenomena where subjects of this identity are the migrants that are moving to Western countries and settle, and they try to find their way around. These subjects actually form communities and have strong ties to their places of origins and their traditions, and the other way around. By linking into their former countries, they get a security. They actually keep a distance and keep up a certain illusion because they are no longer at this place where they think they can always return. They keep, of course, contacts with other cultures and also with members of other cultures as they have to do so. However, they also have an interest not to assimilate and to keep up their cultural identity. Just think, for example, in most countries, there are communities of migrants from other countries. Let's take a look around in Vienna, for example, at all the clubs and associations. In Vienna, we have them all over, but also in the other parts of Austria. Identity is the understanding of people as they see themselves. It is not identity work people need a lot of resources to get recognition for this. Recognition is important for the well-being and for the feeling of self-realization of the members of this community. The national culture and the discourse and debate of a culture creates identity. The national contours and nationalism are pretty ambivalent. But what makes it different from nationalistic and ethnic societies? What is different in a multicultural society? In this case, the citizens belong to different ethnic groups. They are small minority groups. Multiculturalism is an integration policy that formulates the condition in a new setting. Precondition of a policy of multiculturalism is the compatibility of the culture with the freedoms of the individual, the equality of all citizens as individuals. Very briefly, I'd like to talk about the dimensions of diversity. When we look at diversity dimensions, we can see it's the personality, the environment, all the things are linked to the dimension. Please speak into the microphone. And all the elements as they spread to the outside, all the dimensions of diversity. They are decisive, they are necessary, they are important. We have to deal with them. We have to recognize them. We cannot do without them anymore. If people think today that qualities of diversity are not there to be used, they are making some mistake. And this brings me to the diversity in the Austrian Federal Army. And talk about this briefly. Our system, what does it consist of? We have the most diverse subject: men, women, military personnel, civilian personnel, specialists, apprentices, members of militias. So there's a lot of diversity here. And this makes it possible to keep up a system and maintain the system. All the people involved have their justification. The better they are integrated into the overall system and the more their qualities are recognized, the better the system will function. what are the aims that the system is pursuing, the system of diversity? We need diversity management, as most of you are familiar with this. People with all their facets and strengths are to be appreciated and held in esteem as citizens, as suppliers, as customers in their manifold functions. The uniqueness of each person is to be recognized. Diversity is not about that everybody is the same, must be the same, can be the same. No, diversity recognizes the differences and above all, the resulting diversity culture. The challenges here in the Federal Army are, of course, when deployments in various situations, when working together with other military organizations, with militias. Some of these pictures I took on my trips abroad. Without this cooperation, we would not be able to do our jobs internationally, and we have to prepare our soldiers for this. Qualities need to be developed, need to be recognized so that they can manifest themselves in a positive way. And this brings us back to resilience, because if we don't do this, we lose resilience. And finally, I would like to talk about the potential principle. Diversity describes it very well. Diversity is a reality. This is something we cannot find a way around to, but we can use it for the advantage of all the parties involved. Values, attitudes, leading principles in people's thinking. We find it everywhere, and these values are actually reflected and anchored in various light builds. And communication, appreciation, integrative attitudes. This is something that's extremely important and is to be seen everywhere, also in training. We have to promote these strengths. We don't want to consider everything the same and treat it the same. This will ensure that we can benefit from diversity, and the resources, they are all found in the diversity of our recruits, not only with our employees, but also with the recruits. And here we have a lot of potential that I hope we will be able to utilize in an appreciative way. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Georg Ebner. I would now like to ask our next speaker to take the floor. That's the Military Superior Magister Stefan Gugarell. Since 2009, he's been a military chaplain at the Academy of Non-Commissioned Officers. He's now the head of the Institute for Religion and Peace, and well, he had several deployments in Chad, Lebanon, Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I've known Stefan Gugarell as a very interesting and very knowledgeable person in all domains, actually, and my experience with the Austrian military pastors and chaplains is that they have a very comprehensive education and that they are knowledgeable in many different subject matters. So we can discuss very well with them, and that applies in particular to Stefan Gugarell, and he is showing this time and again when he conducts excellent seminars for the cadres of the Austrian Federal Army. And now I'll stop and ask you for your presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always very charming when the titles of these seminars that sometimes don't sound very scientific are not mentioned, and that preserves the semblance of my respectability. Well, I'm shying away to argue with a lot of pictures and images, and most people will be amused by those who who know the classical Catholic discourse and asking about the quality of words or images, I would like to refer to one of the titles of this conference. I would like to refer to the concept of the narrative. In the military and strategic version of the dangerous narrative. So narratives as a basis for religion and state. Now, I would like to divide my presentation into 3 points that each have 3 subpoints. That may seem a bit pedantic, but it makes it easier to count when you're done. So the first item is religions are narrative communities. Often we talk about the religions of the book as opposed to whatever, well, natural religions, animistic religions or whatever. But there is no religion that starts with a book. In those religions that have been handed down to us and those that we only can analyze as historical phenomena, it's always about narrations, stories being passed on. Stories that either are based on divine, heavenly inspiration, a deeper insight into how the world is connected, like in many religions of the East. And already in ancient Rome, they created the concept of religion, and they didn't really know about its true origins, the origins of this word, and they offered several concepts that the nomen, the noun religion, could be derived from. And one of these variants of significance was relegere, so to repeat and keep on reading something and thus to interiorize it. So to read or hear a narration, a story, and then tell somebody else. And this onward telling of stories means that a story is taken out of its context in which it was generated. Because if I tell my niece a story that I heard from my grandmom, that's already a second-hand narration through a storyteller. Still, it can have the same instructive or maybe amusing or terrifying effect. Religions mostly provide an answer to where we come from. They are archaeological. Arche is the origin. So they ask, why is the world now the way it is? So that gives us a certain sense of security, because if we know how things came to be that way, it doesn't sound so threatening anymore. So it doesn't come from nowhere. We know where it comes from, so there is a background. So there is no religious tradition that has not asked the question, where do I come from as an individual, and where does everything I encounter come from? The cosmos, the universe, depending on whether you think it's an orderly or disorderly or chaotic universe. And religions also answer the question where we're going, depending on whether it's the West or East, antiquity or modernity. Our own role is quite different, if it's all written in the book, or whether we can take decisions and thus influence our own lives and the course of the universe. So the question of where do we go, or you could call it a teleological question, the question about the objective, the goal, where we want to go. That's a traditional religious question, and no matter whether it is your behavior that helps you to reach this goal more quickly or more slowly or even miss it, or whether you just follow a plan as it is fated. And that's also a religious answer that is a kind of consolation, because you're no longer stumbling and staggering through a dark mist that is opaque and you don't know where you're going. Even if you don't like this goal that you're walking towards, you have a walking direction and orientation in which you're going to. So these narrations, these stories are passed on from generation to generation, and they answer questions of where we come from and where we're going. Now the second main point is the modern nation-state as a secularized religion. Now commonly, modernity is separated from pre-modernity by saying that the interpretation of reality is no longer referred to a religious phenomenon. In Europe, that is often, well, God the founder, God the founding father, or the creator, but by self-confident own stories. Now, at a first glance, this may seem liberating, and in revolutionary movements, this motive of freedom is a very central one, but a new story also creates new problems. So on the one hand, if you only focus on European history, that with some delay was imposed on the entire world because the European nation-state has to be accepted by everybody if they want to be present in the United Nations. So this modern territorial state differs from the state of a union of persons in that the people gathered in the state have to be structured by something that they have in common, be it biology, race, genetic, be it linguistic as a language group, or be it as a religious group, a state religion. So what unites us is not that we follow one ruler, each in his own language, like with Emperor Maximilian. In Austria we can of course always use this trick box. Even Emperor Karl, who had to be able to answer in several languages. So the territorial state is no longer defined by belonging to one ruler, but by a seemingly measurable foundation that can be measured from the outside. This means in turn that this new form of state also has to give itself a new genesis, a new original tale. A genesis story, we need to know where we come from and where we're going. This cannot be God or the ruler, so it has to be something new, such as, for example, the revolutionary event that created this new form, or a biological origin that comes before any hybridity or mixing that would fictitiously build up such a pure original culture. And thirdly, the modern nation-state as a secularized religion also asks us to ask the question, where are we going? What is our goal? The paradise of the toilers or workers in socialism will be one form, or the ethnically pure nation-state that are keeping out all those who weren't born here by high walls. Well, this is also a question of where do we go, what do we want to achieve by our efforts and our military strategies, maybe even. What's interesting in this context is the socialist, communist and nationalist formula of oaths that they have to swear, to see what the basic narrative that is given to soldiers when they join the army. What do they need to even be able to repeat when it comes to defending the home, creating space for our people, or realizing socialism all over the world? Now this brings me to the third point, because theologians should always end on a hopeful note, an optimistic note, and not just provide an analysis of the sometimes very sad reality. But still I have to go down one more level and then we'll head back up. I'll come to the 20th century and I'm asking the question whether we managed to go beyond the modern nation state and who also come up with founding myths and narratives for the international community of nations, so that the question of where we come from and where we're going can be answered conclusively, so that people can be brought together as a whole. Individual religions and individual nation states are sometimes not credited with being able to do that. So in the 20th century, nation states are becoming allies against each other as the Central Axis powers or as the Entente Cordiale. They go beyond their nationalisms, but only in order to make their own nations even stronger and more powerful. So it would be an interesting thought experiment to reflect on what would happen after victory of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So if these four allies, with all of their diversity, would they have fought on the same side after that victory, or would they have said, well, we defeated the others, now we have to fight against each other? Second, the attempt at coming up with a narrative that places all people under a general principle. And on the 10th of December, we are going to celebrate this in a special way. The General Declaration of Human Rights by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 10th of December 1948 could be understood as such an attempt, and let me open up a parenthesis, if you want to ignore which states had voting rights in the General Assembly and which ones were still a colony and thus without voting rights. But still, this is one attempt to come up with a modern narrative where we come from, where we derive our freedom and our intellectuality, and that the state needs to open up these opportunities for people. I would like to conclude on 3C, as promised. Great stories, great narratives in the Austrian Federal Army constitute an important foundation. What we are trying to convey to our soldiers is where we come from as individuals, as Austrians, as part of international alliances and as part of the global community, and what we are standing for. Well, these are not only the constitutional goals of the Austrian armed forces, but it should go well beyond that. And we also need to show up that in this large, broad-based narrative, not only of the individual, but also of Austria, Europe, and the entire world, there are also the small narratives of our biographies, our predilections, our religious, political, and world views can be integrated. So the great worry that everybody has is, if I were to join one narrative, I would have to give up my old narrative. But we should not let the people who are trying to make us afraid scare us with that, because I think that humanity is clever enough to do that, and this is why we have such conferences, and this is why we're going to have a discussion after this presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Stefan Gogarel, for your presentation.
Thank you. Now for our last speaker on the podium, and this is University Professor, Architect, Christian Hanus. Welcome. Dr. Hanus is the Dean at the Faculty of Education, Art and Architecture at the Donau University at Krems. He's the head of Department for Building and Environment, with special consideration of architecture and engineer sciences. And his focus in research is building technology, building efficiency, and building physics, with a focus on existing buildings. Why is Dr. Hannes here on our panel? What is he go? Well, he's going to represent the cultural aspect, and I consider it very important to be looking also at our topic from the technology point of view, and we are looking forward to your talk. Thank you for the invitation to this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, from my point of view, would like to make a contribution and structure it as follows. Intercultural focus in a threefold approach: generation, reconstruction, and cultivation. Generation, I'm going to actually talk about the the Danube limes. This is one of a city in northern Italy that was on the border. There are various points I would like to make. I would like to include the military aspect. One of the best examples and projects of the past years was the nomination of the Danube limes between Regensburg and the Black Sea. The Danube limes, it's a very, very long stretch. The borders of the Roman Empire were about 8,000 kilometers long, starting in Scotland, across Europe, and along the Danube to the Black Sea, to Asia Minor, back to Great Britain. An incredibly long border, the largest archaeological area in the world. Some stretches in the past were put on the UNESCO Cultural Heritage List. Great Britain, for example, in 1987, the limes there was put on the list in 2005, other stretches in 2008. It was a very difficult process to get the Danube limes onto the list. The rules had been changed a couple of times for inclusion into the list, but finally, together with others, we actually realized that the change of the rules was a cultural enrichment. It was decided to actually look at the borders of the Roman Empire as a cultural heritage site in its totality. This includes Germany, Austria, Croatia, all the way down to Bulgaria, Serbia. These are international projects, and this stretch will be registered at the UNESCO World Heritage. This is always something that is based on an outstanding universal value. And this outstanding value makes this heritage special for mankind. And it was especially interesting to see the dialogue. All regions, all countries along the former border have very different ideas and concepts with a view to this heritage from antiquity. This monument is manifold and very diverse, and it was important for the registration and getting the limes onto the list of cultural heritage sites to select carefully. There were many, many discussions that were truly enriching and absolutely exciting. It was a very difficult process where we then managed to decide what the Danube limes actually is, and we found a common denominator in the end. Tunisia got the southern limes, and they were put on the tentative list. Tentative list means this is a sort of waiting list in the nomination process for World Heritage Site. Objects that are to be considered to be put on the list. UNESCO then checks carefully. There are preliminary investigation whether this meets all the criteria for inclusion, and then the nomination process proper starts. Now, this situation is means that you are pretty focused, and sometimes you may get reproached, well, you didn't include us, you didn't talk to us, because this is our common heritage, because the borders of the Roman Empire touch on so many countries and cross so many countries, Morocco, Tunisia, they all have the Roman limes, and they want to have it registered as cultural heritage, but here is a lot of potential from the point of view of cultural politics. We can identify with it. It is a basis that means we have something in common and can serve as a basis from Regensburg, Lower Austria, Slovakia, Hungary. We actually submitted together. Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, they actually put it on the tentative list. Romania has not done that yet. They are working on it. They call it the Dutch limes. The Germanic limes was actually going to be submitted in 2020, and the nomination for the Southern limes the process has started. So we have a cultural heritage here, but it's also about how can you fathom such heritage that crosses 3 continents, 22 sites alone in Austria. It is a so-called stretch monument covering a lot of, there are many structures at Mautern, Dresmauer, Zeiselmauer, Carnuntum in Austria, where there are still buildings left, castells left, there are defensive towers or the basis of towers left. And this can actually be shown very well and compared to other defensive structures along the limes. We have Astoris Zwentendorf, where we just have a field, really. Everything is below ground and can be conserved. So here is also the point is to raise awareness, to show up the non-visible part, the treasures and assets in the ground. We have different methods today to make the invisible visible, to redraw the lines of the wall and the fortifications that are below ground. So there are a lot of things that can be done, and this was seen in the project, that there is this cultural heritage is actually an incredible enrichment. It's important to have a management plan for this, to elaborate conservation projects and to do the necessary investigations. Interdisciplinary work is required regarding the construction work that was done. They will then yield the resulting management plan. The Danube limes actually is a fortification along the border. Of course, this gets us into the protection of cultural heritage sites. Many locations of these towers are at points that are invisible, or they are at sites where there are fortifications of modern times. So the question is, how are we going to classify and protect these sites? And it's going to be especially important to actually get them together and draw up a systematic military list. The cultural heritage protection is certainly not the main task of an army, but of course there is a military connection, and there are some sites where it is important to have this cooperation also with the military, because we see there are many disciplines working there, archaeologists, of course, first and among them. It was about managing and coordinating the work in workshops and conferences, and also to do salvaging work together, organize the salvaging. This is a new intercultural dialogue that was generated by this work that will actually pay off over the generation to come, and this is certainly breathtaking. Let's talk about reconstructions, things that were destroyed that need to be reconstructed. Earthquake in 2016 and another one that followed in 2017. One of the sites that was destructed, Accumuli in Italy, where our university was taking part in the reconstruction effort. And in September we are going to found a reconstruction school in connection with the authorities there and the ministry. It will be operated by them with the regional participation in this project. Now, a city was destroyed. It has to be rebuilt, and the great challenge here is, how are we going to rebuild? Many of the buildings that were destroyed had always been there. Then they were never documented. There are no plans. We need to do research. We have to look at the ruins. We have to study the photographs. We have to talk to people in order to understand what the city actually looked like, or the town rather. And this was very important, and became clear during the process that the access to the building structure was important. It was important to reconstruct the building substance, the actual structure, in order to make it possible to rebuild the town as such, and the business life there. So life in general, including ecology, agriculture, and all the city's intangible assets, they need to be reconstructed, restored, and this can only be done if the actual building structures are rebuilt. Here, let me give you one example. One aspect that is not considered a lot is the entire area is hilly, mountainous even. This is above Accumuli. Here you have the historical town, and they actually operate in agriculture. If these people leave, this is not only that the town is destroyed and deserted, but the land is no longer cultivated. So agriculture is very important. The biggest challenge that immediately after the earthquake, the people were evacuated into hotels. In the region, in large hotels were actually used to accommodate entire towns, and they were far away from their towns. The towns were empty. One of the few people who stayed was the vice mayor, Valentini, the vice mayor of Accumuli, and he took care of the sheep, of the goats, and all the other animals that were left behind by the people who had left during the evacuation. So he was busy taking care. His house had been destroyed as well. He actually then lived in a hut. He makes cheese, wonderful pecorino, and the area produces a number of great specialties. Spaghetti alla matriciana is from this area. Spaghetti Trisciana is from Accumuli, and so it is worth actually salvaging this cultural heritage. This is actually a cheese made out of sheep's milk, and is actually a very traditional recipe. So this is an area, in short, that has great cultural heritage and produces specialties. The cheese manufacturing facility had to go on operating, and eventually they had to sell it because they couldn't really keep it up any longer. The identity-forming features were rebuilt, so to say, and reintegrated during the reconstruction process. Here, the cultural depot in Città di Tugale, and here the Ministry of Culture, together with the fire brigades and the Carabinieri, actually salvaged all these cultural assets, cataloged them and stored them. This included paintings from churches, sculptures from altars, and so on. So it was interesting. Some of the cultural and arts were actually found in places where they hadn't really been expected. What was noticeable, remarkable, however, was that actually there were some real treasures that were being found and that have significance for the religious life. They are used for processions that are actually identity-forming elements and have a great significance for the religious life, for the people. The intangible levels incorporated here were actually became evident during the salvaging operations. And the church bells, especially, that were stored there, they tell us a great history. When they were salvaged, there was the idea on the part of a representative from the Ministry of Cultures in 2017 that it would be a great idea if at Easter Saturday night the church bells would be rung again. The fire brigade actually set up this structure here, a sort of campanile, and Easter night the bells were rung. So and people came back to the area. These are elements that show how important it is that all these levels need to be reconstructed, and how important it is to reconstruct them. And this is something that people often forget about today when there is reconstruction work, that the intangible levels need to be incorporated as well. There was a lot of military cooperation. I was mentioning this briefly before as something that is very important. Unfortunately, in many cases, it's forgotten about, and it feels a little strange for the military personnel to be doing this kind of work. We need a lot of communication and interdisciplinarity as an approach because different worlds are working together. The civilian part, the military part, the archaeologists, the architects, and this was the reason why we did a summer university with workshops on these topics to show to people the different cultures that were being involved here in the salvaging process. And this also shows how important it is that the military is prepared for this kind of rescue operations of cultural heritage objects. And also the people side was stressed within a large international project for the European that was called Safeguarding Cultural Heritage after man-made natural disasters, promoted by the European Commission. And the survey was done as a result where, in an anonymous way, people were asked about their experience in this, and also about the participation of the military, and there are limits as to competences. But what was also shown is that there is great complementing of various competences, including the military competence. And so we tried to actually position the military in this study done for the Commission, and actually. There was a good outcome, and we were very grateful for the support of the military and the work they did in this process. With these words, I would like to thank you for your attention. It's been a pleasure to be talking to you. Thank you.
Danke, Herr Dr. Hanus.
Thank you, Mr. Hanos. Ladies and gentlemen, it's already quite late. Still, at the end, I would like to give you the opportunity of asking maybe one or the other short question. I have a comment and a question. The comment, Mr. Trauner, when you talk about a just war, you also have to talk about a just peace. This may be a new wineskin, figuratively speaking, but the question is, can there be a just peace? So my question to you would be, I can't question your strategic concept, but the White Book of Germany speaks about resilience 9 times without ever defining the term. You have suggested a definition, but I have 2 questions on that definition. The first one being, if you write that resilience requires adaptation, but I see this as like the submission of Houellebecq. And if resilience only starts when the risk has been identified, it is too late. I think that resilience needs to start before that, in analyzing the risk, and not only when the risk materializes. Now, the first question was for Mr. Trauner, the second for me, right? Okay, Mr. Trauner, please. Did you get the question? Okay. You're completely right, of course. Especially in the German-speaking countries, the concept of a just peace is a targeted contrast to the just war. The just war, of course, well, I consciously didn't use this. I talked about bellum justum, because justus doesn't mean fair or just. It means responsible, if you will, and not what we understand by fairness or justice today. So I do understand this discussion, especially in Germany or German-speaking countries. How can you responsibly shape peace? To me, the core message of this discussion is that we say that it cannot be the objective of strategic action to wage war. So it is a means to an end, according to Clausewitz. And what is the end? What is the purpose? Well, from the ethical point of view, it can only be a satisfactory political state. And that is the main message in the current military ethical discussion. I hope that I answered and interpreted your question correctly. Thank you. I would like to briefly talk about resilience. It's already quite late, so maybe we can hear one more question. The Austrian Federal Army has the concept of resilience implemented in its strategy concept. My basic understanding of resilience is that the military as such is a factor of resilience for the overall state. What I wanted to emphasize in my presentation is that we should focus on people first and foremost, the personal resilience, the individual resilience. We need to make sure that our people are well trained, they're well managed, that we have a people-centered approach in leadership, because that leads us to more organizational resilience. Resilience is always imminent and is the basic task of the military. One more, the last question, please. The last question from this gentleman. It was very interesting to get different perspectives on one of the same subject. That's always very helpful. But I have a question, or an argument and a question. The concept of resilience, from my perspective, is a buzzword, a fashionable term. As a troop commander at the operative level or at the tactical level, in order to explain this to an officer, well, he says, resilience, I can't work with that. I participated in this academic seminar, but it's going to take me weeks to understand this. Well, I would tell him, you know, resilience also contains principles of leadership, ability to fight, endurance, stamina, and re-establishment of the fighting power and strength. And resilience means asymmetrical warfare. Can you work with that, Lieutenant? And he said, yes, thank you. So is this argumentation right? Are these all new concepts that describe well-known phenomena that in our troop work from the young lieutenant all the way up to the colonel, which I am? We have worked through these concepts for many years every day, and now these new concepts come up where young officers and we ourselves ask ourselves the question, well, what's the point of it? Where does it take us? All these academic ideas don't help us at the troop level. That's my question for you. There's nothing to be added to that. I fully agree with you. That's the way I see it as well. And I have tried to also explain this in my short presentation. I believe that the concept of resilience is just a neologism, a new word. That's something that we always live on in the military. Okay, so I apologize. If there's any questions, we can discuss them in the break. And I would like to ask you to also be there for the synopsis after the break, where we're going to summarize both panels for the benefit of the audience. And I would like to wish you a pleasant break. I would like to thank our panelists for their presentations. I would like to thank you, the audience, and all the best for the further conference.